Se vi potete un po', ripeto, accomodare, così io darei già inizio. Allora, buongiorno a tutti e grazie per essere venuti. Per la prima volta qui ad Altamura presso la nostra associazione AMC, cari amici, accogliamolo con un applauso, la US Wheat Association. Vi ringrazio per aver accettato il nostro invito, siamo orgogliosi e onorati di avervi qui per la prima volta e spero che sia l'inizio di una lunga e proficua collaborazione fra voi e la nostra associazione. Ora passerei immediatamente alla presentazione, perché comunque ecco, il lavoro si svolgerà un po' a questa maniera. Ci saranno prima 2 relazioni, poi ci sarà una pausa di 10 minuti, poi ci saranno ancora altre 2 relazioni e poi gentilmente, diciamo, da parte della US Wheat loro hanno voluto offrire il buffet, ci presenteremo a quella parte per il buffet. Iniziando dalla mia destra, il signor Jan Flank, vicepresidente regionale dell'associazione US Wheat, poi Rutger Cohen, direttore regionale marketing sempre per l'Europa della US Wheat, e Eric Olson, specialista marketing commissione del grano duro e del Nord Dakota. Volevo anche, lo faccio ora, ringraziare un po' chi ha partecipato con me per l'esito di questo incontro, tutti quanti i miei collaboratori, la segreteria, i miei collaboratori, consentitemelo, insomma, ecco, mio figlio Nicola, voi sapete che io in inglese sono un disastro, ma se non fosse stato lui io forse sicuramente non avrei saputo fare meglio. Bene, di nuovo grazie a tutti, passo la parola a Jan Flank.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. And before I begin, I would like to thank Mr. Pinero and the hospitality of the Cereals Association. They've done a very, very good job organizing the event. Very friendly welcome to us here from US Wheat Associates, and we sincerely appreciate their effort and friendship. As was mentioned, we have a few presentations for you today. We'd like to spend the majority of the time talking about the new harvest in the United States. We produce 6 different types of wheat in the US, but what we'll talk about today is what's most interesting to you here in Italy. So we'll be talking about durum wheat, which is obviously significant for this area. And then we'll also be covering hard red spring wheat. And Rutger Kukuk will review the world's wheat supply and demand situation. But to start, I would like to do a short introductory presentation, introduce US Wheat Associates to some of you that might not be completely familiar with us. US Wheat Associates works on behalf of American wheat farmers. There's 21 wheat producing states in the US, and they're all members of US Wheat Associates. And so what we do is we work on their behalf overseas. They pool their resources together, and then they provide us the funding to do marketing activities, market development activities all over the world. So some of the items we focus on, first our mission statement is to develop, maintain, and expand international markets to enhance the profitability of US wheat producers and their customers. So we work for the producers, but we're also looking out for the interests of buyers of US wheat. We have multiple activities that we do every year. One of our primary things is trade servicing. We like to go out and meet the mills, talk to the buyers, talk to the technical staff. We like to make sure they're getting what they expect from the quality of the wheat they purchase from the United States. So we're very much a service-oriented organization. We also do a lot of technical assistance. So we have, from the region that I'm working in, we have technical specialists headquartered in Casablanca, Morocco. They're going out to mills to do troubleshooting on certain products, certain cargoes they've brought in if they're having quality issues. But most of the time it's a back and forth to provide feedback and information as we can. And then of course we like to promote the consumption of wheat products generally speaking. US produces 55 million metric tons of wheat and we export half of that. So it's important to us to see the wheat industry globally strong and healthy. US Wheat is a nonprofit organization. We don't buy or sell wheat. I think that's a misconception oftentimes. We would like to see people buying US wheat, but we do not take part in any transaction. We provide service to buyers, service to wheat producers in many ways, as I just explained. Really, the global market is extremely competitive. There's multiple different origins. You're familiar with Canada. In our Asian regions, we're competing strongly with Australia. And it's important for us to try to provide services that our competitors do not. So you don't find very many organizations in other countries like us that provide technical assistance and marketing assistance. And one of our main activities every year is we do a very thorough survey of the crop, the new crop in the United States. We collect samples from farms, samples from elevators. We test and report the wheat, flour, and end product quality of all of the different wheat classes. And we have the reports translated into many languages, and we give presentations just like this all over the world. So you saw out on the table we have these books, and this is the first year we've had these books translated to Italian, and hopefully that's beneficial for you. But this is one of our main activities, so it's important to us to be very transparent with buyers of US wheat. We like to report good news all of the time, to tell you the quality and everything is fantastic, but we like to be honest if there are problems, and we like to make you aware of any issues ahead of time. And so that's why we publish this information. It's non-biased, it's completely transparent, and we think it provides a good service to millers and users worldwide. So US Wheat Associates has many offices around the world. We have a very strong concentration in the Asian market. This is the fastest growing market for wheat imports out of the US. Japan, Korea, and Taiwan have been very large buyers for a long time. But we've seen a lot of growth in the South Asian region as well. So Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines are extremely important. We also have an office in Mexico City and Santiago that would handle the Latin American portion of our business. That's a very good region for us. It's logistically close, so we compete quite easily in that area. So the part of the world that I'm personally responsible with and Rutger is responsible with would be the European Union. So Rutger and I are headquartered there in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. We have a small office in Moscow that's collecting information on our biggest competitor. And I'm also responsible for an office in Casablanca, Morocco, which is handling the Maghreb region, big Durham users as well. And we have an office in Cairo, Egypt, that's handling the Middle Eastern portion, really focused on the GCC countries. And so it's a very large region. And we have some work also in sub-Saharan Africa, primarily Nigeria, who's a very big importer of hardwood winter wheat. So there's just a snapshot of the top 10 customers for US wheat. This is a 5-year average. Historically, the biggest buyer is Japan. There have been consistently over 3 million tons for many, many years. Our neighbor, Mexico, is a big buyer, just over 2 million tons. Then you see quite a few other Asian countries in the mix as well. And then ninth would be the EU. So the EU is usually around 800,000 tons to a million tons per year. And I would say Italy is the majority of that business is coming into Italy, and we appreciate the business, of course. It's very important to us. So we spend a lot of time trying to improve our service to the Italian market, taking feedback on the quality of the durum and spring wheat. We take that information, take it back to the people in the U.S. that develop the varieties that we produce to try to meet the needs that you have for quality and production. This was the share of world markets in the 1970s. Of course, this is what Rutger and I would prefer, to have the United States be over 40% of the world market. For the longest time, there was really only 3 major wheat suppliers in the world: US, Canada, Australia, and to a lesser extent the EU. But if you come to the current market, it's changed so much over the past 10 years. A lot of new production coming in the Black Sea. It has displaced, honestly, a lot of exports from the United States. So this is the previous 5-year average. The US is only 20% world market share, so down from 45% to 20%. The Black Sea went from virtually nothing to 20% of the market, and the EU is around 25%. So it's changed a lot over the past 10 years, and so it's even more important for us now to stay in contact with our very good customers and to try to provide a good service. But I think the most important thing we like to point out is that oftentimes wheat is considered just a basic food commodity, but we think of it as an important ingredient to the final good, the final product. So when we look at wheat, we look at it as an important ingredient to pasta, important ingredient to cake, biscuits, this type of thing. We don't look at it as just a generic commodity. And so even though we've had a reduction in our market share by volume of wheat sold, the U.S. is still by far the biggest seller in terms of value, how much money it's worth, because we try to get our product sells for a premium compared to most other origins. And you can see here, this is the dollar value from the previous 5 years. And the U.S. is just under $9 billion, and Canada was just over $6 billion. And so there's still quite a big difference between the quantity of wheat we sell and the value, the dollar value, compared to our competing nations. And another important thing that we work on at U.S. Wheat Associates are a lot of policy issues, trade policy in particular. Trade policy can have a huge negative impact on trade or a very positive impact, depending on how you look at it. And there's 2 items that we're working on right now, which I think are very important. I believe this first item is a bit sensitive in Italy. It's very important to you as well, and we're following it very closely. So right now we're having a close look at the pesticide policies in the EU. The EU membership is taking an increasingly hard-line position on pesticides. I think there's a lot of news about glyphosate in the media here, and a lot of news, a lot of debate in the political arena as well. The WTO, World Trade Organization, has an SPS agreement that requires scientific risk assessments for policies affecting imports. And then, as far as we can tell, recently, the EU is ignoring some of its own risk assessments. So there'd be scientific approval for certain things, but then later on it would not be allowed due to political reasons. And we're also following, there's a long list of countries objecting to the EU endocrine disruptor policies at the WTO. see, these aren't just big agricultural developing countries. There's also a lot of many poor developing countries that are concerned with this. And so these are ongoing issues that we're working on with our policy people in the United States, working with our counterparts in Italy as well. And we're hoping, and in the EU, so we're hoping to have some positive outcomes from some of these issues. In terms of the pesticide policies, we try to look at it in a few ways. You know, for us in particular, I work for farmers. My bosses are farmers, and so the last thing I want to see is for farmers to lose some of their most important tools in producing high-quality wheat, high-quality commodities in general. And so we sort of look at the pesticide policies in terms of how it will affect farmers. And our view is that it will hurt EU farmers, in particular if they lose some of these options to produce using glyphosate, for example, some of the others. It will also affect imports because zero tolerance for pesticides is virtually impossible to meet. So when you call for zero tolerance on something, it's very difficult if there's cross-contamination or the logistical system has a certain pesticide from other food commodities. And once it hits imports, it will become an issue at the World Trade Organization, and then obviously you'll have challenges. So it's a negative thing to have a lot of these new policies coming through. The second thing we've been focused on for quite a while is the Turkish flour exports. We've been challenging Turkish flour exports to South Asia for a long time. I mean, I think many of you are familiar with pasta exports and flour exports. And we've been working with South Asia to combat some of the subsidized flour that's leaving Turkey and entering markets at significantly lower rates. In our view, flour export subsidies are extremely destructive. Number one, it undercuts U.S. wheat exports. We have 90% market share in the Philippines, is when you have 300,000 tons of subsidized flour entering into the Philippines. That costs 500,000 tons of U.S. wheat. And so it was a big problem for us. And it threatens the existence of U.S. wheat customers worldwide. And I also believe it displaces opportunities for EU flour exports, especially into the sub-Saharan Africa and North African markets. This is where we've seen a big growth in Turkish flour over the past few years. And many of these countries are natural trading partners with Southern Europe. And so we view it as a big problem. This is just a chart of Turkish flour exports. In the dark blue bar there, you see exports to Iraq. This is even underreported. It's about 1.5 million tons of flour per year, subsidized at a price that's lower than what they can import wheat for. But I think most importantly is the light blue bar, which would be Africa. Most of this is going into West Africa. It went from just over 100,000 tons to over 500,000 tons of flour over the past, since 2010. So in our view, these are opportunities that are being missed out by flour millers in Portugal, Spain, Italy, and it's unfair competition. And we've been doing our best to try to find solutions to this problem. Some of the things that we've done with Turkish flour is we've worked with the Philippines on anti-dumping legislation. It's worked, but it's up for renewal for 5 years. We did the same thing in Indonesia. We could try to work with some of these individual markets in West Africa, but it's typically difficult to convince countries of relatively low income to stop importing cheap food products. So that's probably not the best route. We've also encouraged some countries to raise the most favored nation rate on flour imports, but again, that might not be that beneficial to EU exporters unless they have preferential free trade agreement access. So what we've been trying to do is to coordinate a strategy with the EU Flour Millers Association, flour mills in the Middle East, and to work on a solution through the WTO to try to raise the issue at the international trade level. But so far it takes a long time, but we view this as a big challenge for EU mills, a big challenge for the Middle Eastern mills, and a big challenge in South Asian mills. So that's just a short introduction of US Wheat Associates. We are here to service you. We're here to provide as much information as possible, and we're here to answer any questions you have. We have a lot of books outside that are the Italian crop quality book, and there's also a USB drive that's got all of these presentations, and then it has additional presentations that would break down each wheat class with even more detail. So if you want even more detail on durum, it will be available on the flash drive that's outside in the hallway. With that, I'm finished with my presentation. I'm very pleased to see all of you here, and I look forward to answering some questions later on. But I'll introduce our first speaker, is Erica Olson. She's the marketing specialist for the North Dakota Wheat Commission. When I mentioned in my introduction that US Wheat Associates is funded by state wheat commissions, North Dakota is one of the biggest in the United States. So I'll pass this on to her. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. As Ian mentioned, I represent the producers of North Dakota, and North Dakota is the largest producing state in the US for both durum and hard red spring wheat. So the first topic that I will cover this morning is the quality of the US durum crop. And then after that, I have a couple of more topics to cover, expanding a little bit more on what Ian covered in regards to glyphosate, as well as some breeding efforts going on in our country that relate to quality. Durum production in the United States is concentrated in two separate areas. So the northern durum production is in western North Dakota and eastern Montana. We also have another region, desert durum production, grown in Southern California and into Arizona. Northern durum production is the largest. It accounts for about 75% of total US production. Desert durum accounts for about 20%. Based on our export markets, the majority of the US durum flows either through the Great Lakes ports or the Gulf. Our largest customers are, of course, Europe, as well as the North African market. So the bulk of our durum does flow through the Gulf or the lakes. The samples for the crop quality report coming from the northern durum region are collected directly from producers as well as from elevator locations. All of the analysis for the report is done at the Durum Quality Lab at North Dakota State University in Fargo. As Ian mentioned, there is even more detailed information available on some of the presentations on the jump drive. We split out the quality data into regions for the northern durum production area, 4 in North Dakota, 2 in Montana. This slide shows the production percentage by area, and you can see that durum production is very concentrated. About 65% of it is in the northwest corner of North Dakota and northeast Montana. Our durum production continues to move west as the crop prefers dry conditions, so very little of it is produced in the eastern part of the state. The desert durum samples for the crop quality report are composite samples collected at grain handler facilities. This year's durum crop, our biggest issue in the northern plains was unfortunately quantity of production. We had very dry conditions throughout the growing season, which reduced yields, and our production is about 50% less than 1 year ago. The one benefit to the dry growing conditions is that disease issues were almost non-existent for this year's crop. Harvest this year was fairly dry, but unfortunately we did see some areas that did receive some precipitation at harvest, and that did lower the color in a small percentage of the crop. This map is the U.S. Drought Monitor. It's dated August 1st, but it's representative of the entire growing season for durum. So you can see this is the northern durum growing area. You can see here it's colored in red to dark red, which means that those areas were in a severe to exceptional drought situation throughout the whole growing season. Most producers in that area received 50% of normal precipitation. Some only received about 20% of normal average precipitation. And so this chart very visually shows the effects of the drought on yields this year. You can see Montana last year had a record yield of 2.7 tons per hectare, and with the drought, it dropped down to 1.1 tons per hectare. And the yield in North Dakota wasn't quite as severe. You can see a very large decline. All right, I will get right into the quality data now. It's split into two categories. On the left is the northern durum data. On the right is the Pacific Southwest or the desert durum data. Test weight for both areas this year was just down slightly compared to a year ago, but for the most part, fairly strong test weight in the crop. Damaged kernel for the northern growing areas is much improved compared to last year, very low at 0.1%. A year ago, we had some issues with our crop, disease pressure that produced higher than normal DON levels. And this year we had virtually no issue. Foreign material is generally not a problem, 0%. Shrunken and broken kernels are slightly higher this year, 1.1% in the northern durum area. Not too surprising given the dry conditions. We saw some broken kernels, some shriveled kernels. Total defects at 1.2%, most of that being the shrunken and broken kernels. We also see shrunken and broken kernels and total defects slightly higher in the desert durum crop. Vitreous kernel content, the northern durum crop slightly below last year's level at 88%. Always very high in the desert durum area, 98%. Overall, in both regions, the crop grades a #1 hard amber durum. This is the distribution for the hectoliter weight, and you can see it's very similar compared to a year ago. We do have a slightly higher percentage that falls into some of those lower categories, but on average, fairly equal to a year ago. Vitreous kernel distribution, just one area to point out. We have about 25% of the crop that shows slightly lower vitreous kernel content, and that represents the areas that did see some harvest time rain. Vitreous kernel content by region, I just want to point out that this is the area, northwest North Dakota, that did see some rain at harvest, but still the average is fairly high at 84%. Here is the grade distribution. So 43% of the northern durum crop is a #1 hard amber durum, and an additional 26% is graded in the #2 or 3 hard amber durum. So fairly high grading crop for this year. Dockage in the northern durum crop is higher than normal, 1.1%. And again, because of the drought, we saw more weed pressure, and some of that plant material was in the harvest samples. Moisture is slightly lower, again, due to the dry conditions. And moisture is always quite low in the desert durum area, 6.6% this year. Protein in the northern durum crop is quite a bit higher than a year ago, 14.5% on a 12% moisture basis. So that is about a percentage point higher than last year. Protein in the desert durum crop is slightly lower, but is still averaging 13.5%. Here is the protein distribution chart. And you can see the dark green color for this year's crop. About 65% of this year's crop, it has a protein level of 14% or higher. And here is the protein breakout for the northern durum area by region. All of the areas are above 14%. The exception is this area of North Dakota, where it is 13.3%, but very little of the state's durum production is in that area. 1,000 kernel weight for this year's crop for both regions is slightly lower than a year ago. And looking at the northern durum kernel data, you can see that there's a lower percentage of the kernels rated in the large category and more in the medium. Again, that just shows the effects of the drought on the kernels. Here's the 1,000 kernel weight distribution, and again, you can just see that it's trending slightly lower than a year ago. Ash in both regions for this year's crop is lower than a year ago, 1.46 compared to 1.61 in the northern durum crop. Again, that's on a 14% moisture basis. Falling numbers, while lower than a year ago, are quite stable at 380 seconds. We did not see any sprout damage in this year's northern durum crop. The desert durum crop always has extremely long falling number values, no issues there. The dawn level of this year's crop falls below 0.5 parts per million, and the majority of the samples had no dawn detected at all. And that is quite a bit different from last year. Last year's value listed here at 0.7 is probably a bit understated, but the key takeaway is that dawn was not a problem in this year's crop. Here is the falling number distribution, and again, you'll see that the vast majority of the crop is above 350 seconds. Dawn levels by region. The only area where we saw any samples that had dawn was in the northeast part of North Dakota, where only about 4% of our production is. But again, very few samples showed any dawn level at all. Total extraction in both regions is slightly lower this year, but semolina extraction is showing higher than 1 year ago. And the flour ash for both areas is showing lower than a year ago. Flour protein, following the trend of the higher protein in the grain, 13.8% in the northern durum crop compared to 12.6% a year ago, and slightly lower in the desert durum at 12.4%. Wet gluten is higher in the northern durum areas, very similar in the desert durum area. We saw a large increase in the gluten index for the northern durum crop, increasing from 61% last year to 86% this year. Part of this can be attributed to the dry growing conditions, but I will also discuss that some of this is due to varietal development of stronger quality durum varieties. Alveograph data for the northern durum crop and the desert durum crop showing stronger compared to a year ago. The mixograph data as well for the northern durum crop showing stronger. We're at a 5.7 compared to a 5.1 last year. The desert durum crop is at a 7. The color values are very similar. In the northern durum crop, though, we are seeing a slightly lower B value for the yellow color in the semolina. So this just shows the mixograph class, the northern durum in between a 5 and a 6, and then the desert durum right at a 7. Evaluation of the cooked pasta, both areas showing an improvement in pasta color compared to last year. The color score in the northern durum area is a 9 compared to 8.5 last year, and the desert durum is at a 9.8. Cooked weight values are very similar to a year ago. Cooking loss is lower, 5.9% in the northern and 5% in the desert durum area. And cooked firmness is stronger in the northern durum crop. Here's the pasta color scores by region. So you can see distributed between 8.5 and 9.5 for pasta color. So in summary, the crop is high grading. Most of it is a number 1 hard amber durum. We have just a small portion of the crop that did get rains at harvest, which did affect some of the vitreous kernel content. Protein is very high this year, on average for the northern durum crop, 14.5%. Total extraction is a bit lower, but semolina extraction is showing higher. The pasta cooking qualities are improved over a year ago for both areas, and a big relief for both producers and buyers is that disease pressure was very low and no significant issues with dawn in this year's crop. However, I do want to make the comment that there is a fairly large quantity of the 2016 crop left. Some of that did have some higher dawn values. So of course, be aware that that should be left in your contract specifications to avoid any issues with that. This concludes the Durham quality information. As I mentioned, I do have a few more slides on different topics. But first, were there any questions on the quality? All right, I will move on. I would like to take a couple of minutes to discuss the Durham breeding efforts in the United States. When it comes to Durham varieties, breeding can be difficult. The breeder has to meet goals for both producers and end users. For Durham, producers generally want yield, disease resistance, protein is important, and also vitreous kernel content is important as it is a factor for price. End users in general want protein, gluten strength, low cadmium uptake is an important one in Italy, semolina color, and pasta color. In general, when you're breeding, if you have a high yielding variety, a lot of times the end use quality tends to be a bit lower. And so the goal for our breeders is to balance both of those, to have a good agronomic variety and a good end use quality variety. The lifespan of a variety is about 5 to 6 years. So producers plant a variety that works well for them, and then after a few years, they're looking for a variety that has improved characteristics. We view this as a positive trend. There are two varieties that were quite popular, Montrail and Lebsack. At one point, they accounted for about 70 to 80% of our Durham acres. They were developed in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and they didn't have the best end-use quality. So we're seeing a positive trend where some of the older varieties are now declining in acreage and make up only a minimal percentage. And all of the varieties listed on the left are newer varieties with improved quality. And as you can see, those are increasing in our acreage makeup. This is very important because our new varieties definitely have better end-use quality. As an example, looking at gluten index, Montrail, which is an older variety, has a gluten index of 20. On the left-hand side, many of our newer varieties on average have gluten index from 70 to 90. And so the increase of plantings of these newer varieties is helping to increase our end-use quality. A similar chart for the pasta color. Again, the older variety Montrail is one of the lowest, and all of our newer varieties show an increase in that trait. For a while, I know there was a big concern about cadmium in uptake, and our breeder did put that in as one of his screening tools for new varieties. And his goal is to now make sure all new varieties released are low cadmium uptake varieties. And so the two on the right, ND Grano and ND Riveland, were specifically bred for low cadmium uptake. And you can see this year's data showed levels of 42 to 44 parts per billion. So about a third less than our older varieties. All right, the last topic that I'll cover in this presentation and Ian touched on it, is the sensitive issue of glyphosate. For those of you that aren't aware, glyphosate is an herbicide used to control weeds during the growing season. It is also registered in the United States as a pre-harvest desiccant to dry down the crop before harvest. In the US, it's used on approximately 30% of wheat acres, and most commonly it's used for weed control. So it's applied prior to planting or after harvest for weed control. Using it as a pre-harvest aid is primarily done in hard red springweed and durum, and it's used in about 2% of total US wheat acreage. The amount that it's used varies from year to year. If we happen to have a wet growing season, producers may use it as a tool more often if needed to help harvest the crop. It is applied after the crop has reached physiological maturity, and producers must wait at least 7 days after application before they harvest. So why is it used as a pre-harvest aid? Well, one is to dry down the crop in a year where it has been cool or an extended long growing season. They need to get it dry enough to run through the harvest machine. But also in a year like this year when it was very dry, producers had issues with late season weeds developing in the field. And so it can be used for weed control prior to harvest. Another reason is to preserve quality. Where durum is grown in the northern part of the United States, we are prone to getting rains at harvest time. And the longer the crop stays in the field, the more risk it has for quality declines because of wet conditions. We know this is a very sensitive topic. It's a practice that consumers don't care for. So the question we get a lot is, what are the alternatives, if there are any? One is swathing or windrowing the crop, so cutting it down into rows and then harvesting after it dries out. This is more expensive and time-consuming for producers to utilize. Also, if the crop is left in rows on the ground, we have the same issue. If it rains, it's very susceptible to sprout damage and bleaching. And that is one reason many producers moved away from using that method. The other alternative, and this is what many durum producers do already, is just to leave the crop to dry naturally. And 9 years out of 10, that's a very feasible practice for most durum producers. But again, it's a bit risky because it can push the wheat harvest out later. And also weed control does become an issue. There are 3 other herbicides that are approved for pre-harvest desiccation. However, they are more expensive. They are not as effective in drying down the crop. And they're usually not chemicals that producers would choose to use for this type of application. We know that this is a growing issue, and there has been growing interest from both domestic and international buyers for contracting durum that has not been sprayed with a pre-harvest desiccant. Producers are willing to do this. They understand the importance it has to the industry. The one main concern is with the residue level. I think the main concern is that if there was a 0 residue level, and as Ian mentioned, that is almost impossible to obtain. So I think both sides need to work together to determine what residue level is acceptable. So in 2017, producers did contract with end users to grow durum without using pre-harvest desiccation. There were some positive outcomes for this. As I mentioned, many producers don't use it as a common practice to begin with, so it made no difference in their production practices, and provided them with a price premium. Also, knowing the sensitivity of this to some of our customers, they know that it may help maintain or expand market opportunities. Of course, there are still many concerns over this, the first one being the residue level. And this year I think it was obtainable, but the concern again is if it moves to a 0 residue. They are also concerned that it could start to become a market discount factor, similar to protein, to vitreous kernel content, and would therefore continue to affect their price. The issue that we had this year is always a risk, production shortfalls. Many producers grew a crop that was half of what they would normally grow or less. And so they did not have all of the production they needed to fill their contracts. And then the last one is the question of what's next. What will be the next chemical that they won't be able to use? What will be the next production practice that they are not asked to use? They understand the glyphosate issue, but the concern is what will be the next demand. So the contracts for this year's crop, there was a very large interest from producers in doing those contracts. And for the most part, they were successful. As I mentioned earlier, the main issue that they had was the drought, which caused a production shortfall. But I think our producers continue to look forward to working with the industry on managing these residue level issues. Thank you for your attention, and again, I'm happy to answer any questions there may be.
Okay, I think we'll just take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back, and then we'll continue with Rutgers' supply and demand presentation. So if we could be back in 10 minutes, that would be excellent. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Rutger Koekoek. I'm US Wheat's Regional Marketing Director for Europe. And I also would like to use this opportunity once again to thank the Association, Nunzio and Nicola, for their excellent work and help with preparing this conference. We're very happy with the number of people attending. So once again, thank you. In my presentation, I'll discuss the world wheat supply and demand situation, and the numbers that I'm using in my report are based on the USDA report that was released last week, November 9. In the first part of my presentation, I will discuss the global overview of the wheat supply and demand situation. This slide, and I've skipped the previous slide, but this slide is showing you the world wheat production and world wheat usage. And the blue bar in this chart represents the world wheat production. Now, world wheat production this year is projected at 752 million metric ton, and that is down 2 million metric ton from last year, but it is still the second highest wheat production ever. World wheat consumption, represented by the green line, is unchanged from last year and is projected at 740 million metric ton. It is notable though that feed wheat consumption, feed wheat usage this year is much lower, about 7 million metric ton lower, and the reason is that the quality of the wheat crop in Canada, China and also the US this year was better than last year, and for that reason less wheat in those countries is used for feeding purposes. This map is showing you the forecasted change in world wheat production from last year. And globally, world wheat production this year is down by 2 million metric ton, as I've mentioned. And the green countries on the map are the countries where wheat production is expected to increase this year. And the red countries on the map are the countries where wheat production is expected to decrease. Now, the biggest production increases this year have been reported in India, where wheat production was up 11 million metric ton, in Russia, where wheat production was up by 10 million metric ton, EU, up 6 million metric ton, and North Africa, where wheat production was up by 4 million metric ton. The biggest production decreases this year have been reported in the US, where wheat production was down by 15 million metric ton, Australia, down 12 million metric ton. Now we need to consider that the wheat crop in Australia, the harvest has started a few weeks ago and it will continue until the end of December. And Canada this year, where wheat production was also down by 5 million metric ton this year. This map is showing you the forecasted change in world wheat exports from last year. Total wheat trading volume this year is down by 2 million metric ton and totals 181 million metric ton. The biggest winner this year in terms of wheat export volume is Russia, and they're expected to export 5 million metric ton more than last year. And the EU also is expected to have a slightly higher export number, but I'll get into that later because I think that the EU actually will more or less export the same amount as last year. The biggest decreases in terms of wheat exports this year are expected in Australia, where exports are expected to be down by 5 million metric ton. US exports are expected to be down by 2 million metric ton. And Ukraine, where exports are expected also to be down by 2 million metric ton. This chart shows you the world wheat ending stocks. Now, world wheat ending stocks are the wheat stocks that are remaining at the end of the marketing year, so by May 31st of 2018. Now, world wheat ending stocks by the end of this marketing year are projected at 268 million metric ton, and that is 35% above the 10-year average of 199 million metric ton. But note that the stocks that are available to the world market are a lot smaller. And they are the stocks, excuse me, they are the stocks of the historical 5 major exporters, being the US, Canada, Argentina, Australia and the EU, plus the stocks of the Black Sea countries. Now those stocks that are available to the world market this year, at the end of this marketing year, are projected at 74 million metric ton, and that is down 4 million metric ton from last year, but still 6 million metric ton above the 10-year average of 68 million metric ton. So yes, these stocks are decreasing, but they are still ample. This slide is showing you that 47% of the world ending stocks are located in China, equivalent to 127 million metric ton. Now the stocks that are located in China are not relevant for the world market because China doesn't export any wheat. And as such, these Chinese ending stocks, despite the fact that they're huge, are not having any influence on wheat prices. The stocks that are available to the world market, as I've told you, are the stocks of the historical 5 major exporters, plus the stocks of the Black Sea countries, and they are projected at 74 million metric ton, or about 28% of the world ending stocks. These 2 slides I will skip, and this slide as well. And now I will get into discussing the wheat supply and demand situation of the most important wheat exporting countries. Beginning with Canada. Wheat area in Canada this year rose 8%, spring wheat area, and totaled 6.3 million hectares. Durum area in Canada fell 13%, and totaled 2.1 million hectares, which is more or less equal to the 5-year average. 90% of the wheat in Canada is grown in the western prairie provinces of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, and about 10% of the Canadian wheat production is winter wheat, and that is grown in the province of Ontario, just north of the Great Lakes. The growing season in Canada this year was characterized by very dry weather and by an early harvest. This rainfall map is showing you that the rainfall in Canada during the growing season from April 1 through September 10 was much lower than average, as is indicated by the yellow and orange colors in this map. Rainfall in many cases was less than half of the average. And that resulted in sharply lower yields. Spring wheat yields in Canada were down by 9% this year. But look at what happened at durum wheat yields. Durum wheat yields in Canada this year were down by 36%. So low yields. Harvest in Canada is finished by now, unlike last year. Last year Canada had a very wet year, and still by this time of year 20% of their crop was unharvested. But this year, harvest finished early. Also, the quality of the Canadian crop is good, and most of their crop is in the top 2 grades, grade number 1 and grade number 2. The only minor negative point is that protein content of the Canadian durum and spring wheat crop is slightly lower than last year. Total Canadian wheat production this year, 27 million metric ton. Down 15% from last year. This includes 4.3 million metric ton of durum wheat, down 45% from last year. 20 million metric ton of spring wheat, down 2% from last year. And 2.8 million metric ton of winter wheat, down 22% from last year. Wheat exports are projected at 21 million metric ton, and if realized, that would be up 4% from last year. Continuing with Australia, wheat area in Australia, more or less the same as last year. Most of the wheat in Australia is grown in the states of Western Australia, New South Wales, Victoria, and Southern Australia. And also the growing season in Australia was characterized by very dry weather during winter, which obviously has hurt the wheat development. And that situation, interestingly enough, was opposite of last year. Last year, Australia had a very wet year, very moist conditions. But this year, as you can see on this rainfall map, the rainfall from April 1 through September 13 was very low in Queensland and New South Wales, and in many cases was less than half of the average. Australia had the warmest winter ever, and also they had one of the driest winters ever. So this dryness obviously hurt wheat development, and yields this year in Australia will be down sharply, and they are down 36% from the record yields that we saw last year in 2016. I skipped the previous slide, and this slide shows you that total Australian wheat production this year is projected at 21.5 million metric ton, which is down 36% from the very high yields of last year. And the US Agricultural Attaché actually thinks that Australian wheat production this year could be slightly lower even than the 21.5 million metric ton. And he is estimating that wheat production in Australia this year is about 20 million metric ton. So for that reason, it is possible that the US Department of Agriculture in their next report might revise this number of 21.5 million metric ton down slightly to a number that is closer to 20 million metric ton. Wheat exports from Australia this year are projected at 17.5 million metric ton, and if realized, that would be down 22% from last year. Continuing with Argentina, wheat area in Argentina more or less the same as last year. Most of the wheat in Argentina is grown in the southern states of Buenos Aires and Cordoba. And last year, the new government of Macri, he decided to eliminate the 23% export tax in Argentina. And as a result of that, the wheat area in Argentina, especially last year, increased significantly. So Argentina nowadays is planting more wheat and less corn and soybeans. Growing season in Argentina characterized by excessive soil moisture. This map is showing you the top soil moisture level on October 31st. And as you can see, as indicated by the blue and dark green colors, especially in the south of Argentina, the moisture levels were excessive. We have seen heavy rain during the planting and growing season, and that resulted in half of the acres being impacted by excessive moisture. And as a result of that, we saw significantly lower harvested area because many acres were flooded and could not be harvested. The harvest in Argentina has started in the north and is working its way down to the south and will continue through January. Now, as a result of the moisture in Argentina, there are increasing concerns about the quality of the wheat crop in Argentina. So that is something we should all follow very closely. Wheat production in Argentina this year projected at 17.5 million metric ton, down slightly or 5% from last year. And some experts, including the US Agricultural Attaché in Argentina, is forecasting that wheat production in Argentina could be even a little lower, and he's estimating that it would be about 16.8 million metric ton, so down a little bit from the 17.5 million metric ton of last year, of this the USDA. Total wheat exports this year from Argentina are projected at 11.7 million metric ton, and if realized, that would be down 12% from last year. EU, I'll be very brief. The wheat area in the EU was down 2.4% this year. Total wheat production in the EU this year, 151 million metric ton, up 4% from last year. And that includes 100... Do you still hear me? Yeah. 142 million metric ton of common wheat, up 6.9 million metric ton from last year, and 9 million metric ton of durum wheat, down 0.9 million metric ton from last year. Total wheat exports from the EU to countries outside of the EU, so-called third countries, are projected at 28.5 million metric ton, and if realized, that would be up 4% from last year. However, the current export pace of wheat from the EU is down 25% from last year. So for that reason, it seems unlikely to me that the EU will export 28.5 million metric ton, and the number at the end of this marketing year probably will be closer to about 27 million metric ton. I'll skip this slide and I'll continue with the Black Sea area. The Black Sea region is the former Soviet Union, excluding the Baltic states, and the most important wheat production in the Black Sea area are Russia, Ukraine and Kazakhstan. Now total wheat production in the Black Sea this year is 139 million metric ton, which is up 7% from last year, and it is the fourth consecutive year of production growth in the Black Sea area. Black Sea wheat exports this year are projected at 57 million metric ton, and that is up 7% from last year. And it also is the fourth consecutive export record for the Black Sea area of wheat exports. And it is about 16 million metric ton above the 5-year average of 40.8 million metric ton. A little more detail about Russia. Wheat area in Russia about unchanged from last year, about 27 million hectares. Wheat yields were up by 14% this year and averaged 3.1 metric ton per hectare, which is 33% above the 5-year average. Protein content, as a result of the very high yields, the protein content of the wheat crop in Russia is relatively low. And the quality is slightly better in the most important export region in the south, and especially the W values and the test weights this year are a little higher than last year. 70% of the Russian wheat production is winter wheat, is mainly grown in the south and the central regions of Russia, and 30% of the Russian wheat crop is spring wheat, which is mainly grown in Siberia and the Urals. Russia this year, or last year, had a very mild winter and a very low amount of winter kill, and that was followed by very beneficial spring rains. This rainfall map is showing you that in March, April and May, Russia received a good amount of beneficial rainfall, and that was followed by almost ideal harvest conditions. During the month of July, the weather in Russia was very dry, so it resulted in favorable harvest conditions. So all in all, we can say mild winter, rainfall at the time that Russia needed it, followed by very dry and ideal harvest conditions. Now that resulted in a record high average yield level of 4.18 metric ton per hectare of winter wheat and nearly record levels of spring wheat yields of 1.7 metric ton per hectare. Total wheat production in Russia this year, 83 million metric ton, and that is up 14% from last year. And according to the Russian Ministry of Agriculture, Russian wheat production actually is even a little bit higher, and they are projecting total Russian wheat production at 87.6 million metric ton. But this includes the wheat production of the Crimea, which is not included in the USDA number. And it is also the quantity of production before drying and cleaning. And typically about 6% of the Russian winter wheat crop is lost during the drying and cleaning operation. Ukraine, the slide about Ukraine I'll skip, but the quality of their production this year is more or less the same as last year. 40% of their crop was of milling wheat quality. Wheat production in Ukraine, 26.5 million metric ton, about the same as last year. And wheat exports are projected from Ukraine at 16.5 million metric ton, which if realized would be down 9% from last year. In the third part of my presentation, I'll discuss the wheat supply and demand situation for US wheat. And this slide is showing you the US wheat plantings. And as you can see, the planted area this year in the US was 18.6 million hectares, which is down 8% from last year, but it is 4 million hectares less than the 10-year average of 22.9 million hectares. Also, the harvested area this year was very low, it was 15.2 million hectares, which is down 14% from last year. Now this slide is showing you the evolution of the wheat area in the United States over the past 2 decades. And as you can see, the wheat area in the US this year, as I've told you, was 18.6 million hectares. And that is 6 million hectares below the 22-year average of 24.4 million hectares. The reason for the wheat area in the US going down is that the returns or the profit per acre is relatively low and poor, especially in comparison to soybeans, but also in comparison to corn. So for that reason, wheat area has been going down in the last 2 decades, whereas the corn and the soybean area has increased. Total wheat production in the US this year projected at 47.4 million metric ton, and that is down 25% or 15 million metric ton from last year. Harvested area was down 14% and average yields were down by 12%. And the US this year had the lowest harvested winter wheat area in more than a century. Total wheat production in the US was the lowest since the year 2002 and 2003. Wheat exports from the US this year are projected at 27.2 million metric ton, and that is up 5% from last year. The current export pace seems to suggest that the US will indeed be able to achieve this export volume, and actually the export volume probably is going to be closer to 28 million metric ton. So quite similar to what we have seen last year. This slide I'll skip, and then I'll discuss the growing conditions this year of the spring and northern durum wheat crop. Now Erica has already told you, she has already given you some information about it, but this rainfall map is showing you that in the month of June and July, the rainfall in North Dakota and Montana was exceptionally low this year, as is indicated by the yellow and brown colors in this map. And the result of that is reflected in this US drought monitor by August 1. And as you can see, there has been very severe drought conditions by August 1 in eastern Montana and in western North Dakota. And this chart is showing you that an exceptionally high percentage of the spring wheat crop this year is rated poor to very poor, ranging from 40% rated poor to very poor in North Dakota to about 70% rated poor to very poor in South Dakota. So a very difficult season for the US spring wheat growers and durum wheat growers as well. Total US spring wheat production this year projected at 10.5 million metric ton, which is down 22% from last year. And the supply situation for US spring wheat, therefore, is relatively tight this year. Total supply of spring wheat, which is beginning stocks, plus production, plus imports this year, are projected at 18.9 million metric ton, which is 2 million metric ton below the 5-year average of 21 million metric ton. A little more detail about the global and US durum wheat production. The total global durum wheat production this year is projected at 36.6 million metric ton, which is down 8% from last year. And the biggest production decreases this year have been reported in North America. Total Canadian durum wheat production this year down 43% from last year. US durum wheat production down 50% from last year. And even the production in Mexico this year was down 9% from last year. A little more detail about the growing season and the production in the US. Durum area in the US was down 4%. The prices of durum wheat at planting were not as competitive as in previous years. And on top of that, northern durum producers last year had quality problems in 2016, and also as a result of the quality problems, big price discounts. And for that reason, this year they decided to plant less northern durum than they did in the year before. The harvest, as Erica told you, was done mostly under dry conditions. We have only seen a few rain delays in some areas. And the total production this year was down 50%. And this includes 312,000 metric ton of desert durum that is grown in Arizona and California, and 1.18 million metric ton of northern durum that is grown in mainly in Montana and North Dakota. Total US durum production down 47%. And look at the total supply situation of US durum wheat. It is more or less equal to the 5-year average. Total supply, beginning stocks, plus production, plus imports are projected at 3.7 million metric ton, and that is equal to the 5-year average of 3.8 million metric ton. So the durum supply situation is not exceptionally tight. This slide I'll skip. Erica has shown that. Very low yields this year in North Dakota and Montana. A little more information about demand and prices. The domestic demand of durum wheat in the US this year was down by 13%. And exports this year are projected at 500,000 metric ton, which is down 17% from last year. So far, the export pace is slightly ahead of last year. And the ending stocks in the US will continue to tighten. A little more information about prices. At this moment, producers in the US are receiving about $250 per metric ton for top quality northern durum wheat, which is marginally higher than a year ago, but still lower than the peak prices that we have seen in the US in July of this year. Producer selling so far has been relatively slow. Producers are not very happy about this price, and they are not willing to sell their crop, so many of them are storing their crop expecting higher prices. Domestic demand slowed recently. Many millers in the US decided to buy early this year. When they saw that the conditions in July were exceptionally dry, the millers in the US got very concerned, and they decided to buy the durum wheat early this year. And this is also reflected in this price chart that you can see here. You can see that the red line represents the price of durum wheat, and as you can see, the prices of durum wheat peaked in July, and they have come down since July, and they have stabilized at this level since August. And the reason that the prices were peaking in July was that there was a panic in the market then, because millers and farmers were afraid that they would not be able to harvest even a single bushel of durum wheat as a result of the drought. Then, at the end of July, it became clear that especially in Canada, but also in the US, farmers still would be able to harvest a reasonable crop. This slide is showing you the US wheat ending stocks, and as you can see, the US wheat ending stocks this year, at the end of marketing year 17-18, are projected at 25.5 million metric ton, which is down 21% from last year, but still 11% above the 5-year average. Especially the ending stock levels of spring wheat this year are relatively tight, and they are projected to be 33% lower at the end of this marketing year than last year, which would be 25% below the 5-year average. So spring wheat ending stocks are expected to be quite tight at the end of this marketing year. This slide I'll skip. And then finally, in the last part of my presentation, I'll discuss the wheat outlook for the coming months. And the wheat outlook is mainly based on my personal opinion and my personal assessment of the market. So don't blame the US Department of Agriculture, but blame me if this scenario is not happening. For the wheat outlook, I've distinguished bullish and bearish factors. The first bullish factor is that the US winter wheat plantings are projected to decrease marginally yet again this year. And we are expecting another all-time low of planted winter wheat area in the US after the already record low level of last year. We have heard that farmers in Kansas and also Colorado might plant 10% less wheat, winter wheat than last year. So despite the fact that prices this year are up a little bit in comparison to last year, still the net returns, the profit for the farmer is too low, and yet again farmers will plant less winter wheat in the US than they did last year. Another bearish factor is that we are seeing sufficient soil moisture in the heartland winter wheat area. We have seen timely rainfall at the end of September and in early October as well. And for that reason, the environment for the emergence of the heartland winter wheat crop and for the early crop establishment have been very favorable. Also for the soft red winter wheat, the growing conditions in the early season have been favorable, and that crop, soft red winter, also had good rainfall in October, and for that reason this is also considered to be a bearish factor. This slide shows you that by November 5, 91% of the winter wheat plantings in the US were completed, and that is more or less, that is equal actually to the 5-year average. And that by November 5, 75% of the winter wheat crop has emerged, which is down 2% behind the 5-year average. 55% of the winter wheat in the US is rated good to excellent, and that is down 6% from the 58% that was reported by the same time last year. Now this rainfall map shows you that by October 31st there was sufficient soil moisture in the heartland winter wheat area, with the exception maybe of eastern Colorado and southwestern Kansas, where some more rainfall would be beneficial, but by no means the moisture situation is concerning. So generally speaking, the moisture conditions in the heartland winter wheat area by October 31st were good. Also, for the soft red winter wheat area, as is reflected by the green colors on this map, the moisture conditions in the soil were good and favorable by October 31st. Another bullish factor is that Australia this year, as I've told you, is expecting a much smaller crop. Their production is down 35 to 40% from last year, and that would be 10 to 15% below the 10-year average if realized. Argentina is expecting more or less the same crop as last year, a production of about 17 million metric ton. As I've told you, they're seeing some flooded fields, and for that reason the harvest area will be slightly lower, and also there are some concerns about the wheat quality in Argentina this year. In the EU, also that's a bearish factor. We have seen good planting, germination and emergence conditions so far for the winter wheat. The only exception is Spain, where it continues to be very dry. Bearish is that the winter wheat area in Russia and Ukraine is expected to be at a similar level of last year. And that is bearish because Russia last year had the biggest wheat area since the year 2000. So if the wheat area this year is going to be similar, it means that yet again they will have a huge wheat area in Russia. Plantings are almost completed in Russia. Plantings were earlier than last year and ahead of the 5-year average. Eastern Ukraine and the south of Russia have benefited from recent rains, and that has improved the soil moisture conditions in this area after they saw an extended period of dry weather that lasted until the end of September. Still, more rain will be needed prior to crop dormancy to improve the early crop establishment in the south of Russia and in eastern Ukraine. Now the big question I think for all of us in this room is, will Russia have another record yield crop, another big wheat crop in 2018 again? Because we have seen 5 years of consecutive production growth in Russia. We have seen 4 years of wheat export records in Russia. We also know that Russia is known for big swings in production, historically speaking. They have had hardly any winter kill and no major droughts in the past few years. So the question is, will Russia be lucky again this year? Now this map is showing you that the moisture conditions in the south of Russia and in eastern Ukraine are still quite marginal by October 31st. But at the same time, if you would compare this with the map of the end of September, you would see that the moisture conditions have improved a lot in comparison to 1 month before. Finally, 2 last items that we recommend you to follow closely in the news. First news item is that we are expecting a much lower production and much lower supplies of high quality, high protein wheat this year. The Australian prime hard wheat production this year is projected to be down by 40%. As I've told you, our spring wheat production is down by 22% this year. And also the production of German e-wheat this year, that production is having some issues because Germany had rainfall at harvest time. So the quality of the high protein German e-wheat this year is lower than last year. Now that will result in a much lower availability of high protein wheat in Australia that is available for exports, and also the availability of our US hard red spring wheat for exports this year will be much lower than last year. Now the result of that has been that the price spread between 13.5% protein spring wheat and 11% protein hard red winter wheat, FOB from the Gulf, has widened from about $40 per metric ton in early May to about $80 to $90 per metric ton nowadays. So this is showing that the market believes that the supply situation of high protein wheat this year on a global level is quite tight. Second news item that we recommend you to follow is that the global supplies of durum wheat are also relatively tight. The global production this year of durum wheat is down 8%. But what is more important is that the production of the 4 major exporters of durum wheat this year is down by 24%. As I've told you, Canadian durum wheat production down 46%, US durum wheat production down by 47%, and also the production in Mexico was down 9% from last year. And therefore, the ending stocks of the major exporters of durum wheat this year are projected to be down 29% from last year. A positive note is that the quality of the durum wheat crop in Canada and also in the US this year is much better than last year, when the crop was affected by bad weather and high vomitoxin and DON levels. So for that reason, the available quantity of exportable durum wheat of high quality in both Canada and also in the US will not be much different from the situation of last year. Now, as you can see here, the prices in July of durum wheat moved up sharply when the market was panicking about the drought in the US and Canada. But as I've told you, then by the end of July, the market realized that there still would be a reasonable crop in Canada and there would still be some crop in the US. And since then, the prices have come down to the level that we're seeing nowadays. Well, the last few slides I will skip. So on this, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I also would, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me or challenge the information that I've given you. Thank you. Now, Erica is going to give a final presentation about this year's Spring Wheat quality in the US. And after that, we hope that we can talk with you during our lunch break.
Volevo sapere, durante il momento di panico a luglio, quanta merce hanno importato gli Stati Uniti d'America dal Canada e quanta merce intendono importare fino a fine campagna. E poi vorrei chiedere alla dottoressa se stanno studiando qualcosa per combattere i fusariati che probabilmente causano il DON nel grano. Grazie.
Okay, so the second part of the question about fighting the DON will be for Erica to answer, but I will try to answer the first part of your question, Mr. Lodice. And I will go back a few slides to show you the supply situation of US durum wheat. So you're asking, what about the imports from Canada this year? Well, the total imports from Canada this year of Canadian durum wheat into the US are projected at 1.2 million metric ton, which obviously is significantly higher than the 800,000 metric ton last year. So yes, the market has responded by importing more durum wheat from Canada this year. But as a result of that, the total supply situation at the end, this marketing year is not going to be much different in the US because of the higher imports from Canada. I think I have now answered the first part of your question. Is that right? Then I'll now give the word to Erica to respond to the second part of your question.
In response to the question about what is being done to help lower the incidence of DON, yes, we are working on it. Unfortunately, it's not a very easy issue to target. For the durum breeder, unlike spring wheat, there is no resistance to Fusarium head blight, which is the disease that can cause DON. Genes have been found, but when they are bred into the durum plants, they don't show through, and therefore no resistance. And I believe that's a problem everywhere around the world. However, our breeder has indicated that some of his newer varieties seem to at least show that while they aren't resistant to the disease, they're showing lower levels of DON. So it's not forming as much DON in the kernel. So he continues to work on that. I think everybody would love to see the day where we have some DON resistance in durum varieties, but it's a very slow process. So most of it right now is production practices in terms of rotation, applying fungicide as needed, and monitoring the crop. Did that answer your question? Okay. All right, well, I have the pleasure of giving the last presentation right before lunch, which is usually not an easy task. So I will go through the quality information for the US spring wheat crop. Spring wheat production is primarily concentrated in the northern tier of the United States, right along the Canadian border. Our planting season, I'll characterize it two separate regions. In the west, where it was extremely dry, low yields, similar to the Durham growing area. However, in the east, it was dry, but we had better soil moisture and therefore normal to above normal yields, very little disease pressure. At harvest time, conditions were for the most part dry. A few areas in the north that did get some rain at harvest, but overall good conditions, very little disease pressure. When we do the crop quality data, we split it into two separate regions, basically dividing the production area into east and west. Traditionally, anything grown in the east, represented by this brown color, flows to the Gulf Great Lakes export regions, and anything grown west of there in the green area tends to flow west. So therefore, when I present the crop quality data for today, it will be representative of the eastern growing region. The data is also separated out according to protein. So low protein is anything below 13.5% on a 12% moisture basis. Medium is between 13.5 and 14.5, and the high protein is above 14.5. So this year's data, how it's laid out, the 2017 data, the whole region average is on the right, and then the protein splits are to the left of that data. So our overall test weight, hectoliter weight, is showing higher than last year. So we had good kernel weight and size in this year's crop. Damaged kernel at 0%. Again, very limited disease pressure. Foreign material, no issues. Hectoliter distribution, nothing major to point out here, very average for this year's crop. Hectoliter weight by region, very similar. As we did get further west where it was drier, some lighter test weights, but the eastern growing region, very strong. Shrunken and broken kernels are very similar compared to last year's crop at 0.7%, and that encompasses all of the total defects of 0.7%. One change we have for this year is lower vitreous kernel content. The average is 62% for this region compared to 79% a year ago. Some of this is varietal. But also, again, we did have some rains at harvest in the eastern growing area. So the overall crop grades a #1 northern spring compared to a #1 dark northern spring last year. So it's just primarily the vitreous kernel content that's lower. Vitreous kernel content by region, this is a good illustration of how the quality changes from east to west. We tend to have higher vitreous in the west where it is drier in most years, and it tends to get a bit lower in the east where we have more precipitation and higher yielding crops. In terms of grade, it's a very high grading crop. 97% of the spring wheat rate is a #1 grade. Dockage, fairly similar to average years at 0.5%. Moisture is slightly lower at 12.7% as a result of the fairly dry growing season and harvest conditions. Protein is higher than average at 14.4%, and again, this is on a 12% moisture basis, 16.3% on a dry matter basis. Looking at the protein distribution, you'll see about 60% of the crop has a protein of 14% or higher, and then about a third is in the 13% protein range. By region, we have a couple areas where the protein did fall below 14%. These are areas of Minnesota that saw record yields in this year's crop and thus slightly lower protein. But for the most part, almost every area had a protein of 14% or higher. Ash in this year's crop, very similar to last year, lower than the 5-year average. 1,000 kernel weights are higher compared to a year ago, again, due to the good growing conditions. And falling number is very strong, just under 400 seconds. So even the areas that did have rain, we really didn't see any effects in terms of sprout damage. Dawn level also good this year, less than 0.5 parts per million. The vast majority of the samples had 0 dawn in them at all. Test weight by region, again, just one thing to point out, 1,000 kernel weights. In the east, we're about 2 grams higher than normal, but in the west, you can see the drought effects about 2 grams lower than normal. Falling number distribution, as you'll note, majority of the crop well above 350 seconds. Dawn by region, the only area where we really saw any samples that had dawn in were in the northeast part of North Dakota and into Minnesota, but that was a very, very tiny portion of the samples. In terms of flour data, the lab mill extraction is showing higher than a year ago. Please note this is done on a lab mill that is not optimized from crop year to crop year. It's for comparison purposes only. I will say though that this number is probably slightly overstated, but in general what our domestic millers are seeing is extraction similar to slightly higher than a year ago. Ash is higher, going along with the higher extraction at 0.58%. Protein in the flour, higher than last year, going along with the higher protein in the grain, 13.5%. Wet gluten is higher, and gluten index is very similar to previous years. Falling number in the flour, very strong, over 400 seconds. Meliograph, viscosity is showing a bit lower than previous years, but again, we did not have any major issues with sprout damage this year. Looking at the farinograph data, peak time is showing lower than a year ago, as well as stability time. While we did have a higher grain protein in this year's crop, some of the hot weather did not make formation for the gluten ideal. So it is showing a little bit weaker than a year ago. However, especially when you look at some of the higher protein segments, we are seeing some stronger stability compared to a year ago. And absorption is right on with last year's values. Stability by region, looking at the eastern part of the growing area, some of the higher stabilities are in the very eastern edge, eastern North Dakota into Minnesota. This is not what we would normally expect. Normally we see stronger stabilities in the west. However, we are seeing some varietal changes, and some varieties that are particularly grown in the east have very strong dough strength and other end-use quality. Looking at the oveliograph data, summarizing, the W value is showing weaker than last year, slightly higher than the 5-year average, but in general it's also showing a slightly weaker crop compared to last year. And then the W value, again, on a regional basis, some of the stronger values are in the eastern growing region. And again, that's the crop that does usually flow to our customers in Europe. The extensograph data, resistance is lower, a bit lower than last year, but higher than the 5-year average. And extension is also showing a little bit lower. Extensograph data by region, and again, some of the stronger areas, again, in the eastern growing region. Flower absorption is coming in about 2% lower than a year ago, but again, stronger than the 5-year average. The crumb and grain texture is showing improvements compared to last year. And low volume is slightly lower than both last year and the 5-year average. Again, though, the higher protein segment is showing a bit higher than we've seen in previous years. And this is just a visual of the loaves, from the quality samples. So the left is the Gulf Great Lakes region, low, medium, and high protein. So in summary, for this hard red spring wheat crop, we are showing a very high grading crop. 97% makes the #1 grade. Vitreous kernel content is a little bit lower than last year. Protein content is averaging 14.4%, which is higher. No issues with falling number, very strong crop. The dough quality, the data overall shows a slightly weaker crop than last year, but we are seeing certain areas and certain protein segments that are actually showing stronger than a year ago. Baking quality is fairly good, slightly lower loaf volumes, but again, some of the higher protein areas showing larger loaf volumes than a year ago. So overall, a good grading crop, very little damage, no dawn issues this year, no falling number issues either. So overall, a fairly good year for quality for hard red spring wheat. And that concludes my presentation, unless anyone had a quick question or two. Thank you.
Thank you, Erica. So that was the final presentation for the day. I'd like to thank again the association for making all of the arrangements, and I would especially like to thank all of you for coming and spending a little bit of time with us. I believe we have an excellent durum crop. Quantity is a little bit lower, quality is fantastic. Same can be said for hard red spring wheat. If you ever have any follow-up questions on any of the material in the book or on the flash drive, please feel free to email Rutger, myself, or Erica, and we'd be happy to try to answer those the best we can. Otherwise, thank you very much for your attendance. There'll be a lunch in the back very shortly, and thank you for coming. Appreciate it.
Vi volevo ringraziare per queste vostre, stupende relazioni. Un augurio, come dicevo prima, da parte dell'associazione Young, Rutger ed Erika di potervi avere anche ospiti qua il prossimo anno, perché comunque questo interscambio fra noi e voi io desidero che debba sempre continuare negli anni, per noi, per una nostra grande preparazione e anche per voi. Grazie a tutti quanti. Una cosa mi premeva dirvi a fine convegno, che mi è stata appena annunciato la sottoscrizione da parte del GAL della nostra nuova sede come AMC. Ecco, il Presidente qui, grazie Presidente. Vorrà dire che noi dal 22 in poi tutti quanti ci trasferiremo presso la nuova sede del GAL. Grazie ancora.